Good day and welcome to Glasnost in our time, where we try to look at the world rationally in the hopes that it'll look rationally back. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. It's the 4th of August, 2022. It's a month since the Russians took Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and seemed to turn the tide in the Ukrainian war. It looked as if Russia was going to win. But then the United States started sending a lot of short-range missiles and drones to the Ukrainians. Some are making the argument that the Biden administration is playing for time and is actually playing for a tie in this war in order to try and position the Ukrainians for some negotiations to end the war, maybe as the fall unfolds. Who knows? At any rate, the Russians paused to advance, paused their advance and paused to resupply their forces. And now they're resuming the advance. And so they're marching ponderously westward toward the Dnieper River. And they are talking in more broad, more confident terms about the partition of Ukraine. So how does this look to states that might want to join NATO if they got a chance? Georgia is one of them. Georgia's been a candidate since 2008. Georgia has 2 Russian protectorates inside its territory. It claims these territories, but it recognizes some kind of moderate Russian control of them, Russian sponsorship of South Ossetia and of Abkhazia. Is Georgia eager to get into NATO? Is it still eager to get into NATO in view of what's unfolding in the war? And how has the war changed Georgian views about that? Those are questions that I think we perhaps could profitably pursue with Bryan Gigantino, who's speaking to us today from Tbilisi. He's the author of an article in a recent issue of Jacobin. It has the title, "Georgia's Transition to the West Will Never End." And Bryan also hosts a podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia. So welcome to Glasnost, Bryan Gigantino.
As we say in Georgian, Gamarjoba. Nice to be here.
Welcome back.
Great to see you.
Bryan, you write that Georgia's locked up in a debate about joining the West. I want to ask you about the contending sides in this debate. And I want to ask you about whether the war affects this discussion. And then I want to ask you also about the historic debate that goes on your podcast about Russian and Soviet history. That's a very interesting thought, you know, and this show, Glasnost, is more or less dedicated to pursuing the tasks of Glasnost when they were first taken up. So in a way, this is interesting for us. But before we get started, maybe you could prepare us a little bit by telling us something about Georgia's history since it left the Soviet Union in 1991.
Well, first of all, want to say thank you again for having me on to talk today, and it's a pleasure to be here. I will do my best to keep this succinct. Georgia, as some people know or some people don't know, was part of the Soviet Union. And I think we should start with a little understanding of its place within the Soviet Union. Georgia was not just a Union republic, but was considered to be one of the most, if not the most privileged republic for 2 major reasons. One of them is the very crucial roles at the highest rungs of the Kremlin that Georgians would occupy, most famously with Joseph Stalin, but others as well, Sergio Djornikidze, Beria, and many other mid-level members of the nomenclatura or at the high ranks of the Kremlin were Georgians. So Georgians were intimately involved in the construction of the Soviet project politically. And secondly, Georgia, as well as Abkhazia in particular, were the preferred vacation spots for the highest Soviet elites. And Georgia itself was a esteemed tourist destination in the USSR. So in its place in the USSR, it ended up basically receiving more support and an outsized cultural, gastronomic significance in the Soviet culture and in the Soviet political imagination than it did basically in terms of what it gave back. If that makes sense. It was this 3 or 4 at the time of the Soviet period, 4 to 5 million person region that was seen as kind of the best place to be. Corruption was the most flourishing. You had the most ruble millionaires. You had the highest rate of white collar professionals, and you had year-round access to luxury goods for more of the population. So you have to understand that Georgia had this very good position in the USSR. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Georgia had the harshest decline of living standards. So Tajikistan, for example, had lower living standards and probably saw even lower living standards than Georgia in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. But Georgia saw the steepest decline, which is a very important point, is that it's white collar workers, it's party members. It saw a huge, not brain drain, but what a friend of mine called the brain, like when people who are in these high level positions end up working in the bazaar selling vegetables, right, or driving a taxi. This phenomenon was very extreme in the Georgian case. At the same time, Georgia also underwent the civil war and territorial dismemberment that was due for a number of reasons, in part to the first president of post-Soviet Georgia, Zviad Gamsakhurdia, who himself was a poet, who was a literature professor, who had become a Georgian nationalist in the late Soviet period. He was one of the early participants in the pro-Stalin riots in 1956 in Tbilisi, where a lot of these early Georgian nationalists had actually had their first political experience. There's some great history that's been written about this, where the Georgian nationalism in the post-Soviet period began to germinate, some people argue, in these pro-Stalin, anti-Khrushchev riots in 1956. So this, because of the fact that there was a view that Georgia's privileged position was being questioned by the rise of de-Stalinization. This is an important point to understand, that this kind of experience is going to inform the romantic ethno-nationalism of the early Georgian nationalists, who are going to take an aggressive role towards the independent demands of the Ossetians and the Abkhazians, who had been, during the Soviet period, relegated under autonomous republics, right? They were not union republics. They were actually autonomous republics, Ossetia was actually an autonomous region, and Abkhazia was an autonomous republic. Actually, in 1931, it had gone from a designation of a union republic to a subsidiary republic within Georgia, the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. So the Georgians believed that it was their territory, whereas the Abkhazian post-Soviet elites believed it was their territory, and you had this leading to conflict. So the territorial dismemberment, the reduction of status, as well as the moment when all of these post-Soviet states are starting to try to figure out what it means to be independent in a post-Soviet order. So after Gamsakhurdia is kicked out of office by basically a military coup, Edward Shevardnadze, the last foreign minister of the USSR and the long-standing chairman of the Georgian section of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, leader of the Union Republic, comes back. And what most people, what I think is important for your listeners to understand is that Shevardnadze was adored in the West, right? He was very, very involved in these negotiations, late Cold War negotiations. He was known to be lauded by people like James Baker, people like Ronald Reagan himself had positive things to say about Shevardnadze. And so Shevardnadze was actually very much welcomed by the West as a guy who could bring stability, despite the fact that he was a Soviet statesman, very close ties with Russia still, of course, and had this idea that Georgia should navigate its geopolitical and economic position as one that is both friendly with the West and friendly with Russia. Georgia's place in the world is one of a Eurasian connector, right? One that should have pipelines to Europe, but should also trade with Russia. And so we can think about Shevardnadze's position as being the guy who is sort of the pragmatist, the non-ideological pragmatist, of course corrupt, but corruption was sort of a systemic extension of the fact that the entire economy had collapsed, right? And there's trying to make sense of how to navigate and control basically a state that had collapsed, a society that was, gas is being shut off weekly. People in Tbilisi don't have water or heating. And so it's turning from this, wealthy republic within the Soviet Union to basically third world conditions. And so Shevardnadze, and also the fact that you have these warlords who are in control of territories, you've got the separatist regions, and then you even have the region of Ajara, which was on the border with Turkey, which is where the city of Batumi is located, which in the Soviet period was also an autonomous republic, but in the post-Soviet period had basically was under the control of a single family, and that basically had almost become independent, but through a deal facilitated by Russia in 2004, was brought back under the control of Tbilisi. So you can see that there's like a very complex and dynamic and very, very complicated situation going on. I'm only scratching the surface of.
Amazing to consider, isn't it, Bryan? How complex this state is. And
very, very complex place.
And how during the Soviet period they managed this thing in such a finely detailed way.
Yes, and I can definitely expand on that. What I want to just say one thing for your listeners to try to just finish this story, which is that what's important to know is that in 2003. So first of all, in 2001, Shevardnadze commits to getting Georgia into NATO. I want to just make this point that Shevardnadze, who is seen now by sort of the opposition forces or a certain wing of Georgian politics today as being somebody who was a pro-Russian, Soviet man, corrupt, was actually in fact the opposite. He put Georgia on its western, the opposite, the polar opposite. He put Georgia on its western path. But what he did is he had a very rational way of doing it under basically impossible circumstances, right? He basically tried to bring the nightmare together and basically get a functioning state working. But he understood that Russia was in a complete collapse still, right? Putin comes to office, as you know, in 1999, 2000, but Shevardnadze throughout the late 90s into early 2000s is basically looking at Russia and saying, and this is not my idea, this is other people have said this, is like, there's nothing that they're going to offer us in terms of developing our economy. So what we need to do is we need to navigate a relationship with Russia and with the West. And we think that something like NATO at this point could offer us a form of military and economic patronage, so that in service of state building. And I think that this is sort of, it's like more of a rational kind of understanding. And then of course, Shevardnadze provides more soldiers per capita to the Afghan operation and to the Iraq war than any other country. And that will be increased after he leaves office. So, and with the idea that basically these measures are going to eventually result in them being accepted into NATO. But the next most important thing for your listeners to understand is that in 2003, there's a revolution in Georgia. It's one of the first so-called color revolutions. I could go into a long explanation of that. For your listeners, there is a guy from the Bay Area who was the president of the National Endowment for, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy in Georgia during the Rose Revolution. His name is Lincoln Mitchell. He's a professor at Columbia for a while. I think he still is, but he's from San Francisco. And he wrote a great book about what is called the Rose Revolution, because he was stationed here between 2002 and 2004. He was very intimately involved. There's a great book about the Rose Revolution, which I suggest everybody read, Lincoln Mitchell. I don't agree with everything, but he's got a good play-by-play of what happened from a rational perspective. But
Bryan, before you go further, tell us something about this book. What do you think the main message is about the color revolution in Georgia?
I think the main message is that that the his line is that, and I linked it to this in my article, is that the United States was basically supporting Shevardnadze more or less until the end, but was also supporting the development of a kind of civil society sector that was growing and developing in opposition to him, sort of at the same time.
Yeah.
And they had a sort of complicated position, but that me and Lincoln Mitchell would disagree on a few things in terms of democracy promotion of the United States. He's very critical of how it was used in some places, but maybe saw it as being somewhat beneficial in the Georgian case. I'm not so sure at this point, looking back. But the point is that the argument is that by the time the wheels start turning, the United States has no choice but essentially to support. His name is Mikhail Saakashvili, who will come into power in 2003 as a result of the Rose Revolution. And the result in the Rose Revolution basically is the first color revolution, where a student group, Kamara is what it's called, is going to be one of the leading forces, along with this guy, Mikhail Saakashvili, Columbia-trained lawyer from Georgia, from Tbilisi, who is a you have to understand, because Shevardnadze was already pro-West, he basically assumed a position that was more Western than him. And in 2003, what did that mean? It meant like dogmatic fidelity to the Washington Consensus, to the ideals of globalization, to a US-led order. And in the case of Georgia, and this is the point that I firmly believe in and that I write about and our podcast is about, and what I will hope to continue writing on, is this idea that Georgia had it so good in the Soviet Union that the anti-Soviet politics, the political and ideological commitment to purging the Soviet memory became an obsession of the kind of pro-Western elites. And so they tried very, very hard to basically assert this idea that Georgian nationhood was entirely undermined by the Soviet experience, and that is that has to be accepted if Georgia is to basically assert itself as an independent nation in the modern world. And so they really, really, really push this idea of the USSR as being a sort of external colonial imposition on Georgia, and an extension of the Russian Empire, because of the fact that when Saakashvili comes to power in Georgia, they rebrand the nation. So this is important because when the Soviet Union collapsed, the only flag that the new Georgian state could fly was the flag of the First Republic. The First Republic was a Menshevik-controlled independent statelet between 1918 and 1921 that was basically the result of the Russian Civil War. That's a whole nother conversation I can get into. And so they basically raised this flag and said, we're independent, just like I think, Azerbaijan, Armenia, all these states did, a lot of states did this. But in 2003, they removed this flag and they used this Christian Crusader flag. They said that Georgia they tried to go back to a further older idea of Georgia as the sort of bulwark of Christian Western civilization in the Near East at a time when America was, peak post-Cold War imperial end of history expansion. So to become a client of the United States, Saakashvili tries to blend this idea of Georgia's Georgia's national essentialism with a US-led order, and anti-communism becomes the key component to sort of that nation-building process in the post-2003 order. And so it serves a very useful purpose of saying the Soviet Union was bad. How do you tell an entire nation of people that basically benefited in almost all ways, with the exception of a small amount of people who died if you think about it comparatively, in the purges and in the terror? After that, Georgia was, after high Stalinism, Georgia was basically nothing but growth, nothing but high living standards. There was more money in people's pockets there than any other republic in the Union, right? The savings accounts were higher than anywhere else. People had access to illegal, trade very easily. So how do you do that? Well, you have to figure out a way to kind of state build and purge this. Basically, there was this fear that this pro-Soviet sentiment would, be politically inconvenient for this new class of Western-looking elites.
Well, let me ask you about this colored revolution. Do you think the energy for the colored revolution comes entirely from without, or were there internal necessities, internal logic that was going in the direction of the radicalization that Saakashvili represented? In other words, suppose there had been no impulse for colored revolution coming from without, would there have still been an attempt by Saakashvili to make a more radical statement against Shevardnadze and try to push him aside?
I definitely think that something would have happened if there had not, let me put it this way, if there had not been this Western-supported network of civic activists and NGOs in this particular historical moment of globalization, I think what you would have probably seen is a different trajectory, which is some kind of clan politics, which is basically what this is. This is a form of it, a kind of a clan politics and networks that are trying to basically get control of the most valuable asset that Georgia has, which is the state. And the reason it's the most valuable asset that Georgia has is because it's got no industry to speak of. And this is the crucial factor to understand, is that in this, and all post-Soviet states to various degrees are dealing with this crisis of post-Soviet deindustrialization or clan warfare for the resources. But in the case of Georgia, the deindustrialization was so extreme that there is no base of industry and low domestic capital to speak of. So the state ends up assuming this role of being the most valuable asset that these kind of elite clans can hold on to. And I think that would have manifested in some way. In the case of Saakashvili, he's trying to basically represent this younger, pro-globalization, Western-looking segment of the society that I think that the Democracy Promotion Initiative in the post-Soviet world is also trying to mobilize and give a political logic to, so that when they're actually contesting Shevardnadze's legitimacy, they have sort of a very powerful message, which is it's the West, we're against the Soviet past, we're against socialism, right? And in fact, we are pro a radical form of Westernization.
Yeah.
Right? This is why in Georgia you had extreme neoliberal reforms more than anywhere else. And I would just also add, to give a material dimension to this, there's a great book by Mitchell Orenstein and Hilary Appel. Orenstein is a professor at University of Pennsylvania. We interviewed him on the podcast. And Appel is, I believe, at not Pepperdine, but one of these smaller universities in Southern California. I'll remember in a moment. They wrote a book about neoliberalism in the post-communist world, and how they very eloquently point out is that basically all these post-communist countries are competing with each other for investment, for foreign direct investment as a mechanism to get integrated into the West. And Georgia has the most debilitated economic situation, the most debilitated political situation. Its corruption is running rampant. Crime is very, very high, right? Police are stealing from people on the street left and right. It's kind of a dangerous situation. So there's no way that foreign direct investment is ever going to come. And so you can think about the Saakashvili reform era as a kind of like a moment when they are saying our country's ready for investment. At least aesthetically, they're going to make it the most extreme business friendly economic. They're going to put, they're going to ban taxation in the Constitution. They're going to, really push this libertarian ideology in an extreme way. And last thing I'll say is that it parallels this anti-communism that they're using to build the state.
Okay, so fascinating stuff, and we could go further looking into the background and talk all about the response of the Russians to the impositions Georgia made against Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But let me use this time to ask you about this debate that is going on now. And you characterize this in your article. You say that there's a patience argument and there's a shame argument. What are the two arguments?
I will answer that. I just really have to say one last final thing, which is that Saakashvili is in office until 2012. And then when he leaves office, there's a coalition of anti-Saakashvili. His movement is called the United National Movement, called Georgian Dream, which is a coalition of a mixture of different people, which is supported by a billionaire named Bidzina Ivanishvili, who gets most of his money in Russia and other places, just like Saakashvili's economic reformer, economic minister got his money in Russia. These relations to Russia are not so clear-cut on both sides, just to be clear. But when Georgian Dream comes into power, they come into power because there had been resistance to this idea that despite the United States supporting Saakashvili in the United National Movement, he was becoming sort of a draconian leader, consolidating power. There were some prison scandals. He was shaking down businessmen who were opposed to him. There was freedom of speech questions, and so there was that's an important for your audience to understand that there was actually massive protests against his rule domestically, hundreds of thousands of people in 2007 and in 2012. So,
but you think he represents a Russian, what the Russians might prefer as an alternative in Georgia?
This is what I'm going to get into. Is that the current government, which has been in power since 2012, is called Georgian Dream, and they have basically overseen. So in 2008, as your listeners may know, this has to give this background to explain to answer your question, is that in 2008, there's a war with Russia over Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the Georgian state attempts to basically retake South Ossetia by force. That's a very complicated story. What your listeners should know is that in Georgia, it's commonly thought that this was a Russian invasion, that this was a Russian aggression, but the European Union famously produced the Tagliani report, which was a fact-finding mission in 2009, which basically said that Saakashvili started the war. It's a very uncomfortable sort of reality, but it's pretty much well known that that's the case, that the first shelling started from the Georgian side. But when
Hillary Clinton made this argument herself, she said the Georgians started the whole thing at that time. Why do you think Saakashvili did that?
Yeah, this is a debate, and one we're going to have to investigate. I think that there is, my understanding from the literature and that I've read, is that essentially you had a situation where the Georgian government was basically interacting with the U.S. state in two different ways that were not, did not basically overlap. So on one hand, you had army officials, you had State Department officials, and you had basically other higher ups who were very, very pro-Georgian. George W. Bush, of course, president for most of Saakashvili's tenure, the first 4 years, I should say, of his tenure. It's very pro-Georgian, gets them basically this admission, the Bucharest summit in 2008, that they're going to join NATO. But there is a sense of rationality by some of these actors in the U.S. state, which are like, be careful, because again, there's this tension in the U.S. government between a pragmatic and an aggressive relation towards Russia. So that is playing out where they basically are viewing Georgia as in relation to Russia. And so part of the U.S. state is basically saying, like, be careful, don't do anything. We're gonna support you with weapons and funding, but don't go too hard. But then you had on the other side people like John McCain, who were belligerent and essentially had, and then the advisors that were surrounding Saakashvili, people like Matthew Breeza is the most famous one, who are Americans who are there and are basically aggressively hostile to Russia, and are basically trying to get in his mind that if he attacks Russia, or if he attacks and Russia intervenes, that the United States is going to be there to support them. Which, of course, any thinking person knows the U.S. was never going to be there. It was never going to put tanks in the Caucasus Mountains to defend Georgia. They're never going to do that. They won't even do that in Ukraine. So that's out of the question. But at the same time, it's ideologically very convenient to the Bush administration for Georgia to basically present itself as a client state that is a bastion of freedom, where America's foreign policy is working. So that contradiction, I think, is where Saakashvili and the process of trying to state build and basically consolidate territorially came into contradiction. And so the last thing I want to say is that after this war, you have to understand that the Georgian Dream, when they came into power, had this desire to not so much reset with Russia, but to undertake a policy of patience strategic patience. And the idea is that you shouldn't, that Saakashvili caused the war. There didn't need to be a war with Russia, that the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia could potentially be reintegrated into Georgia through diplomacy, and that there's no need to essentially constantly be in an aggressive position in relation to Russia. And of course, this has not always worked in Georgia's favor of, in the sense that, you know, when Georgia, all the Russia needs to do is press a little bit and it can have big consequences in the country. So it's not to say that every act of the current government has resulted in great benefits for Georgia, but and I should also say that it's not all pragmatic and ideological. The elites of the Georgian dream, especially Bidzina Ivanishvili, do have business connections in Russia. So there is a bit of self-interest. We can't deny that. I would never deny that. That's clear. But I also think that, unfortunately, that self-interest does align with, in my view, the most crucial and important national security question for Georgia, which is how do you approach and normalize relations with Russia, which is not politically popular in the country. And I think that Georgian Dream has basically worked very hard, and especially in this Ukraine crisis, to position itself in such a way where they're not becoming a belligerent, aggressive state vis-a-vis Russia, but are trying to maintain a semblance of neutrality as much as domestically possible. Because also at the same time, the Georgian Dream knows that they rely on tourism. The country is over-dependent on tourism. They're over-dependent on Russian tourism. Their wine exports are over-dependent on the Russian market. They are, and they share a border with the country. They can't afford to be, and I think that this is probably what, of course, there's going to be some Georgians who wholeheartedly disagree with the sentiment, but the Georgian Dream also believes, I think deep down, that this is how they're going to get Abkhazia and South Ossetia reintegrated into Georgia, is through.
So how is this affected by the war that's going on in Ukraine? Suppose the Russians are defeated in Ukraine. And now, when I say defeated, that of course includes a lot of definitions of defeat, and suggests that maybe it might just be a psychological defeat. But suppose there's a perception that the Ukrainians have got the upper hand over Russia. How does that affect this debate?
Well, yeah, this is a so I would just say that domestically in Georgia, the question of the war in Ukraine and the government's response, and just all domestic politics in Georgia are basically mediated through the question of Russia and the West. And so let me explain how it's playing out now. The opposition in Georgia basically says that the current government are stooges of Russia. They're integrated with, they're economically allied with Russia, and that they are pushing Georgia off of its Western path. So that is what civil society thinks. I would say the civil society organizations, which are not, in my opinion, kind of genuine civil society. These are basically like, sort of mouthpieces of the opposition, more or less, which is a contradiction for democracy building or development of the country. And the government basically is arguing that that they say this is not true, and they say that the reason that the European Union did not give Georgia candidate status, right? As you know, the European Union, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine applied to the European Union 2 years earlier than they had all planned as a group. Or excuse me, Georgia was planning on applying in 2024. And then when the war started, Ukraine said, we're going to apply. And then basically Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia applied together. And Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine received candidate status. Georgia received not candidate, but a prospective European orientation. I forgot what it was called exactly. I don't have the paper in front of me on the exact terminology. But this created a huge controversy in the country because the position of the government was, well, of course we didn't get it because we're not in a war with Russia right now. Right? The reason that Ukraine and Moldova, well, first of all, Ukraine got it because they're in a war with Russia. They're more corrupt. They're more corrupt than Georgia is. And Moldova got it. They have this recent pro-European government in power, and are also they have this Transnistria, which is a breakaway region with a couple of thousand, I can't remember the exact troop numbers, thousands of Russian troops. And it seems that there was fighting very close to Transnistria when there were some missile strikes that were happening, shelling that was happening near the Moldovan border. Whereas Georgia is actually under no, as I put out in my article, is under no immediate military threat. They've been withdrawing troops from Abkhazia and South Ossetia to go fight in Ukraine, right? The massive Russian base in Armenia has not seen any peculiar action, right? They're basically not. There's no military threat towards Georgia right now, and so the government is basically saying, like, look, we're not at war with Ukraine, so of course they didn't, or with Russia, so of course they didn't give us the status, but the European Union is arguing that the Georgian Dream government has not implemented their reforms that they need to implement correctly, and there is probably some truth to that, but the deeper question is why. And there's the opposition basically believes that they're pro-Russian force that's holding on to power and is anti-Western. Whereas I think there's overwhelming evidence that the current government wants to join the European Union and be integrated with the West, but they also want to maintain relations with Russia because national security depends on it. And so, and that democracy in the country has not been developed properly because actually under Saakashvili, it didn't actually develop properly. They made some reforms, but the country is under the democratic functioning of the state and how it works is like the idea of democracy is used as a tool of nation building, but the democratic institutions don't really work. So that contradiction, I think, has made it into a situation where you've got this quote unquote hyperpolarized political process, and it's not so easy to just implement these reforms overnight when there's a precedent in the country that when you're out of power you're going to go to jail, you know what I mean? So yes, among other things, where the other thing, and the one thing I really need to emphasize is that they developed in a half sovereign way. So what does that mean? Well, on one hand, of course, territories were lost that were considered by the Georgian elites and Georgian political class and many Georgians themselves to be part of Georgia, because in the Soviet period, Abkhazia was part of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. But also, so there's this narrative that Georgian sovereignty is undermined by Russian support of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But the other problem is that the US and the West also undermined sovereignty of the country by essentially creating a civil society that is a very, very, very powerful political actor in the country. Basically, the US and European Union manage the domestic affairs of Georgia. So, and of course, there was this, they sold off so many properties. They basically denationalized everything, that so much FDI has, so much of the country is owned by foreigners, that you've got this trifecta of forces that basically undermine the sovereignty of the country, right? On one hand, people think that the territory is occupied by Russia. On the other hand, the West is controlling essentially the domestic political affairs of the country and telling them at the same time they're not implementing reforms for their own sovereignty. So there's this contradiction of the sovereign management of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one, the most important one to me, of course, coming from sort of a more Marxist left-wing perspective, is that the capital of the country is not owned domestically, right? It's owned by foreigners almost entirely. And this is a long-standing problem in the First Republic. This is also an issue, who's Georgian, who's owning what. So that creates a huge problem where what does it actually mean for Georgia to be sovereign? And I think that this is like underlying a lot of these problems.
Well, fascinating stuff, Guy. I would love to pick your brains on this still more. But let me ask you before we wrap this up, one last question about your podcast. And the thinking behind your podcast is that there's a kind of a review of memory that goes on in not just places like Georgia, but in Russia itself, a review of their how to put it, their rejection of a big hunk of their history, their 20th century history after the Russian Revolution. And, a return to an attempt at a return toward 19th century models and ideology. How is your podcast debating this idea of, what's the word? How shall I put this? Reintegrating the Soviet period, let us say reintegrating the 20th century into the history of the countries of the former Soviet Union?
Well, I would just say that, this is a really great question. Every single post-Soviet country has its own story and its own, local conditions under which this Soviet story is being relitigated or, discussed. Here's what I'll say. When the Soviet Union collapsed, one of I would say the biggest problems was that the Russian Federation inherited the official memory of the USSR. Institutionally, politically, and it became very difficult for other Union republics to sort of claim that Soviet memory. And this is one of the reasons why in places like Donetsk, these people are neither Ukraine or Crimea. They're not Ukrainians. They're not Russians, right? They think of themselves as some other identity. They have a local identity, but they are a very Soviet people, right? And
Soviet people means that they're not nationalists.
Correct. That's right. Right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's exactly right. And the Soviet person, and there's a lot of academic debate about the Soviet person. So, Homo Sovieticus, all this stuff. I don't really want to get into that. But what I just want to say is that each of these societies have these problems of how they can engage with that contradiction of losing the USSR. We see it today in the Ukraine war, right? Where on one hand, both sides try to basically elicit Soviet talking points, Zelensky talking about the defense of the motherland, right? He kind of tries to talk about this, defeat of Nazism in a way, in the same way that the Russian state tries to mobilize that sort of World War II memory as well. It's horrible. But in Georgia, there is an even bigger problem where you had this 2003 revolution that pushed this anti-Soviet memory politics so forcefully into the society. But at the same time, Stalin is from Georgia. And the local love of Stalin is still very big. And a lot of people write on this, like a ton of people writing on this. But there's never been a kind of reconciliation with the fact that Georgia lost so much because of the USSR that it will never gain back. And it's be very difficult for the society, and especially people who lived through the USSR, to come to terms with that. And so I think that one of the reasons that we do this podcast is to try and, in English speaking, and eventually we're trying to do it in Georgian as well, and expand it. But the idea really is to say that, like, the Soviet Union and the Soviet experience in Georgia was not just Stalin and was not just 1937. And it was not just even the act of Sovietization. The Soviet Union was 70 years of like national development, economic development, a political arrangement where there was no ethno-national conflict, right? There was tensions, don't get, it wasn't a utopia, but you had things that basically are now thought of as inconceivable, right? There were no borders. Now everything's borderized, right? Mm-hmm. There was industry. Now there's no industry. There was incentives to build up the place you live. Now everybody's dream is to leave. And I think that, you could, there were all of these things where, you had a whole world that Georgia, Georgia was the privileged republic. It was so adored by the entire USSR for its, food and for its culture and for all it's for, the movies, for music, like in a way that it might not ever regain as part of, as part of the globalized society we live in today. So I would say that and then the most important, as you know, for me and for others is that how can you project a future of socialism, a future for the left, without reconciling what the meaning of this thing was in a way that doesn't rely on right-wing tropes or ultra-nationalist lines of argument. And so I think that what we're trying to do is also is kind of put that out there by talking to people who do serious research on this stuff and people who have something to offer.
Well, lastly, let me ask you about this thesis that is being kicked around. It's mainly an academic idea, but it's suggested that Russia needs to be decolonized and that there has to be a Bandung kind of sensibility that is applied to all the subject nationalities of the former Soviet area, the former Near Abroad. What do you think about that? Is there any kind of an argument? Does anybody argue that Georgia ought to think of itself as part of the third world? Vijay Prashad, you've had Vijay Prashad on your show. Vijay Prashad, has made the argument for the Algerian ideas about organizing the world around Algerian oil production back in the 70s, the new international economic order. He was very enthusiastic about that, and now he sees Russia as part of China, and it's a revival of Bandung. The BRICS are a revival of Bandung. Where does Georgia fit in all that?
That's such a great question. First thing is that I think that this decolonizing of Russia debate is, I don't take it seriously for a lot of reasons, because two things I'll say. The first one is that the people who are arguing for the decolonization of Russia almost all of them today make a categorical error because they don't engage with what the Soviet process did to this arrangement. Because in their eyes, the Soviet Union was an extension of the Russian Empire. And I categorically disagree with this for the simple reason that Tashkent, Uzbekistan, for example, was developed in a categorically different way under the auspices of the Soviet development than it would have been if the Russian Empire had defeated the revolutionary movement and had continued. That's just a fact, in my opinion. I think that this is a categorically different arrangement. Again, tons of scholarship on nation building and development of nationalities. A lot of great scholars doing things like, in the 70s and 60s, third worldist leaders coming to the Soviet Union. Where would they go? Tbilisi, Tashkent, Baku, right? This is what your third world city could look like if you were not being developed, not having your resources stolen by colonial development. And there's something that has to be engaged with on that front, or these decolonial arguments just, I think, are pushing or sort of reaching for straws. And the second reason that the decolonial argument I can't take seriously is that there's not a swelling movement in these places they're talking about. Places like Yakutia or Chechnya are the most pro-Moscow places there are. So who's going to decolonize what and how? I think that like Atlantic, these tend to be Atlantic Council people, or people who are sitting with a professorship at Georgetown University, or working for the Helsinki Commission, and are putting this out as a propaganda. I hate to use this term propaganda. They're putting this out as a sort of ideological counterbalance to arguments they see Russia making about Ukraine being part of Russia and all this stuff. So it's like a sort of, I would say, not psychological warfare, but it's an ideological sort of warfare to try to counter what they see as Russian propaganda. So it's not something I take seriously by any means. And then the second thing I would say in relation to Georgia and this new Bandung in the third world and stuff. Well, I think one of the things you do see amongst a place like Georgia is when they look at the world, right? The elites look at the world, and you see the West. The West does not look too good right now. They're not really offering prosperous, stable future. If anything, the West looks like it's got eternal and persistent crises that it's only starting to deal with. So I think that you look at China. China seems to basically offer the opposite. Not in a cultural. There's nothing like. I don't think there's like a some kind of cultural or political idea that's being offered, but I think that in terms of, we see a lot of African countries. We've even seen upwards of investment of Chinese investment in Georgia, and so I think there are people who are countries in Central Asia and in the Caucasus who are looking at China in some ways and saying, maybe there is something to be said about working closer to take money from the Asian Development Bank, take money from Chinese investment. Because also this is another key point: the Chinese do not ask for political reforms as a part of getting investment in the country.
Well, Bryan, I'm just fascinated with this stuff that we're talking about, and I realize we're just scratching the surface. Is really
I wish I could stay.
A whole lot more we could say about every one of these topics, but we have to conclude. And it's been very enlightening, very illuminating, and everything you've been saying, masterpiece of clarity and lucidity. So thanks a million to Bryan Gigantino for this terrific discussion.
You were the best history professor I ever had. So my pleasure. I talk about you all the time. So I always bring you up. I always do bring you up all the time.
Well, we'll be talking about you, I'm sure, in the future. And we have to say goodbye now for Glasnost. Goodbye until next time, when we will continue to ask the question, we've tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?